You're watching your understanding of history get dismantled in real time. Around you, 1,000 museum exhibits display Iron Maidens and racks with confident little plaques describing medieval barbarity. Documentary narrators speak in somber tones about the Dark Ages. Your high school textbooks showed you drawings of torture chambers. Everyone knows the Middle Ages were brutal, savage, a nightmare of religious fanaticism and casual cruelty. Except most of what you know is wrong, not exaggerated, completely fabricated. The most famous torture devices of the medieval period are hoaxes, created centuries later by entrepreneurs who understood that paying customers wanted to believe their ancestors were monsters, and the real story, the documented truth about medieval justice, is somehow more disturbing than the mythology. Because what actually happened wasn't random sadism. It was systematic social control, operating in plain sight, accepted by entire communities as normal and necessary. If you believe that understanding how historical narratives are constructed and weaponized matters for navigating our own time, consider subscribing. This channel examines documentary evidence without sensationalism, separating what actually happened from the stories we've been sold about the past. Now let me show you what medieval justice really looked like, starting with the devices that actually existed and the ones that never did. When you picture medieval justice, what comes to mind? Dark dungeons lit by flickering torches, Iron Maidens with spike-lined interiors, a leather-masked executioner turning the wheel of a rack while a victim screams. Hollywood has sold us a vision of the Middle Ages as an unending carnival of cruelty, where sadistic lords devised ever more ingenious ways to inflict agony on helpless peasants. The reality was far more mundane, and in some ways, far more disturbing. Because what actually happened in medieval courts wasn't random savagery. It was a calculated system of social control built on public humiliation, religious authority, and the methodical extraction of confession. The tools weren't designed for entertainment. They were designed to maintain order in societies where royal authority was fragile, literacy was rare, and the church claimed jurisdiction over truth itself. Let us talk about what medieval punishment actually looked like when you walked through a town square on market day. Medieval justice wasn't primarily about inflicting pain, it was about inflicting shame. In societies where reputation was currency, where your standing in the community determined your economic survival, public humiliation was often more devastating than physical punishment. The stocks and pillory were the workhorses of this system. Simple wooden devices, found in virtually every town square across Europe from the 13th century onward. The stocks immobilized your ankles while you sat. The pillory locked your head and hands while you stood. Neither was designed to injure you. Both were designed to display you. Here's how it worked. You're a baker who sold underweight loaves. Or a tavern keeper who watered down ale. Or B. You got drunk and caused a disturbance on Sunday. The court sentence isn't prison. Medieval towns rarely had the resources for long-term incarceration. Instead, you're locked in the pillory in the town square for 6 hours on market day, when the maximum number of people will see you. And they do see you, your neighbors, your customers, your competitors. Children throw rotten vegetables, adults heckle and mock. Someone might slap you, not hard enough to cause real injury, but enough to drive home your powerlessness. For those 6 hours, you have no dignity, no status, no ability to defend yourself or walk away. You're an object lesson in what happens when you break community standards. The punishment ends, you're released, you go home, but the memory remains. Everyone who saw you knows you're the baker who cheats his customers, the drunk who can't control himself. In a small medieval community where social networks determined everything from marriage prospects to business opportunities, that stigma could last years. The genius of this system was its efficiency. No need for expensive prisons or jailers. The community itself became the punishment apparatus, and the public nature of the spectacle served as deterrence for everyone watching. But not all devices were equal opportunity instruments of shame. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, reveals the deeply gendered nature of medieval social control. This iron framework, used primarily in Britain and Scotland from the 16th through 18th centuries, fitted over a woman's head like a cage. Most versions included a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue, making speech painful or impossible. The woman would then be paraded through town or chained to a public post, displayed as an example of what happened to women who violated acceptable behavior. And what behavior warranted this? Not theft or violence, but speech. Being a scold, a woman accused of gossiping, nagging, arguing with her husband, or simply having opinions she expressed too loudly. The legal terminology is revealing. Women could be prosecuted as common scolds, a classification that had no male equivalent. This wasn't about extracting confession or punishing crime in any modern sense. It was about enforcing social hierarchy, specifically the expected subordination and silence of women within the household and community. The device made the punishment literal. If you won't control your tongue voluntarily, the law will control it for you. Importantly, these weren't tools of royal courts or church inquisitions. They were instruments of local justice, deployed by town magistrates and community leaders to enforce neighborhood standards of acceptable behavior. Medieval justice was often hyperlocal, reflecting community prejudices and power dynamics more than any centralized legal code. Understanding these devices requires understanding a crucial shift in medieval legal philosophy. For centuries, European courts relied heavily on trial by ordeal, subjecting the accused to physical tests with the belief that God would protect the innocent. Walk across hot coals, plunge your hand in boiling water, be thrown in a river. If you survived uninjured or floated, divine intervention had proven your innocence. But by the 13th century, the Church was backing away from this system. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, effectively ending the practice across Christian Europe. The logic was shifting. Truth would no longer be revealed through divine miracle, but extracted through human interrogation. This created a problem. How do you get reliable confessions? Medieval legal theory held that confessions were the queen of proofs, the gold standard of evidence. But people don't typically confess to crimes that could result in execution, mutilation, or exile. The solution was judicial torture. Carefully regulated procedures where pain or the threat of pain compelled the accused to speak. This wasn't random brutality, it was bureaucratic brutality, complete with legal requirements, documentation, and oversight. Many jurisdictions required that torture only be applied when there was already substantial evidence of guilt, that it be supervised by legal authorities, and that confessions obtained under duress be later reaffirmed when the pain had stopped. The theory was that torture didn't create false confessions. It simply overcame the will of guilty people who refused to admit their crimes. The reality, of course, was that people will say anything to make pain stop. But medieval legal scholars convinced themselves they were pursuing truth through controlled application of suffering. They weren't sadists. They were professionals operating within a legal framework that viewed the human body as a legitimate tool for obtaining evidence. This is what makes medieval justice so disturbing to modern observers. It wasn't chaotic or irrational. It was systematic, justified by legal theory, and widely accepted as necessary for maintaining social order. The devices we're about to examine weren't aberrations, they were instruments of law. Now we arrive at the devices that dominate popular imagination, the ones that appear in museum exhibitions and horror films, presented as evidence of medieval barbarity. But here's what's fascinating. The most famous torture devices of the Middle Ages are largely fabrications, exaggerations, or misattributions created centuries after the medieval period ended? Let's examine the evidence. The rack is perhaps the only device on our list with solid medieval documentation. A simple wooden frame with rollers at each end, used to stretch the body by gradually turning cranks attached to ropes binding the victim's wrists and ankles. It appears in court records, legal treatises, and first-hand accounts throughout medieval and early modern Europe. But here's what those records reveal. The rack was rarely used, highly regulated, and often ineffective. In England, the rack was kept in the Tower of London and required authorization from the Privy Council or monarch to use. It wasn't a tool for common criminals. It was reserved for cases of treason or heresy where state security was allegedly at stake. Records show it was used perhaps 80 times during the entire Tudor period, in a nation of millions conducting thousands of criminal prosecutions annually. Why so rarely? Because legal theorists recognized a fundamental problem. Confessions obtained through extreme pain were unreliable. People would confess to anything, implicate anyone, fabricate entire conspiracies just to make the agony stop. Medieval jurists weren't stupid. They understood that torture produced questionable evidence. More commonly, the rack was used as a threat. Bring the accused into the chamber, show them the device, describe in detail what would happen. Often, that psychological pressure was sufficient to produce a confession without actually applying physical torture. And crucially, many legal systems required that any confession obtained under duress be reaffirmed days later, when the accused had recovered, as a safeguard against false admissions. This doesn't make the rack humane or justified. Stretching the human body causes excruciating pain and permanent injury, but it contextualizes the device with an actual legal practice rather than fantasy. It was a tool of last resort in high-stakes political cases, not a routine feature of medieval criminal justice. Now let's discuss the most iconic torture device that never actually existed in the Middle Ages, the Iron Maiden. You know the image, a human-shaped sarcophagus, hinged like a closet, interior lined with iron spikes. The victim is placed inside, the door closes, the spikes penetrate the body at carefully calculated angles, enough to cause agony and eventual death, but positioned to avoid immediately fatal wounds to vital organs, prolonging suffering. It's a perfect emblem of medieval cruelty, except it's a hoax. The most famous Iron Maiden, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was constructed in the late 18th or early 19th century for a sensationalist exhibition. It was created during the Romantic era, when Europe became obsessed with a Gothic, dramatized version of its medieval past. Entrepreneurs and showmen understood that paying customers wanted to believe their ancestors were barbaric, that modernity had rescued humanity from an age of darkness. So they built props and presented them as authentic historical artifacts. The Iron Maiden became a star attraction in museums and traveling exhibitions throughout the 19th century, complete with lurid backstories about its use during the Spanish Inquisition or by German princes. But search medieval legal records, court documents, contemporary chronicles, church archives. You'll find no credible evidence that spike-lined coffins were used as torture devices. The technology is wrong for the period, the design is impractical, and most importantly, medieval torture was about extracting confession, which requires the victim remain conscious and capable of speech. A device that impales someone from multiple angles simultaneously serves no judicial purpose. The Iron Maiden is Victorian horror fiction presented as medieval history. It tells us more about 19th century anxieties and entertainment preferences than about actual medieval legal practices. The Judas Cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat where the victim was allegedly lowered onto the point, with weights added to increase pressure, occupies a middle ground between documented device and likely exaggeration. We have scattered references to similar devices in late Renaissance and Reformation sources, primarily from the 16th and 17th centuries. The problem is documentary evidence from the actual medieval period, roughly 5th to 15th centuries, is essentially non-existent. The few references we have appear in sensationalist accounts from the wars of religion and Counter-Reformation, periods when Protestant and Catholic propagandists were actively demonizing each other by describing their opponents' torture methods in graphic detail. Were pyramid seats sometimes used? Possibly. Was this a common or widespread practice with a systematic employment suggested by museum displays? Almost certainly not. The descriptions we have are often third-hand accounts, tales of what someone heard happened in some other city, told by people with strong motivations to portray their enemies as monstrous. This pattern repeats across many supposedly medieval torture devices. Scarce or non-existent contemporary documentation, with most evidence appearing in sources written generations or centuries later, often during periods of religious conflict when atrocity propaganda was a standard weapon. Here's what actually happened. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe industrialized and modernized, there was enormous public interest in the bad old days. Entrepreneurs created torture museums, stocking them with devices either fabricated outright or dramatically modified from genuine historical objects. A medical restraint became a torture device. A wooden punishment chair became an iron torture throne. Simple shackles were embellished with spikes and blades, and these modified or invented devices were presented with authoritative-sounding backstories about medieval cruelty. The irony is brutal. The worst documented atrocities of the medieval period weren't the elaborate contraptions in museum displays. They were the everyday, mundane punishments: public whipping, which could strip flesh from bone; branding with hot irons to permanently mark criminals; amputation of hands for theft, tongues for perjury; execution methods like hanging, burning, and beheading conducted in public squares while crowds watched. These were real, documented, widespread practices. But they're not as visually dramatic as an Iron Maiden, not as mechanically fascinating as a rack. So our popular imagination fixates on the exaggerated and fabricated while overlooking the actual systematic violence embedded in medieval legal systems. The truth about medieval justice is somehow more disturbing than the mythology, because the worst aspects weren't aberrations by uniquely sadistic individuals. They were normal, regulated, and accepted as legitimate by society. A woman locked in a scold's bridle wasn't the victim of a rogue torturer. She was sentenced by a magistrate, displayed in accordance with law, and the punishment was considered both appropriate and necessary for maintaining social order. A man stretched on the rack wasn't suffering random cruelty. He was subject to a legally sanctioned interrogation procedure, one described in legal treatises and taught to court officials as proper technique. The devices weren't secrets hidden in dungeons. They were public, visible, part of the ordinary landscape of medieval towns. Children grew up seeing people locked in stocks, watching executions, understanding that this was how justice worked. That's the lesson. Systematic injustice doesn't require uniquely evil people. It requires ordinary people operating within unjust systems, convinced that what they're doing is necessary, proper, and lawful. So, why do we cling to the mythology? Why do museums still display Iron Maidens they know are fraudulent? Why do films and television series portray medieval torture chambers that never existed? Perhaps because the mythology is comforting. If we imagine medieval justice as the work of sadistic individuals using bizarre contraptions, we can tell ourselves we've evolved past that darkness. We're civilized now. That could never happen in our time. But if we acknowledge the reality that medieval injustice was systematic, bureaucratic, and normalized, we have to confront uncomfortable questions about our own legal systems, our own accepted practices, our own capacity for normalizing cruelty when it's presented as necessary for security or order. The devices are myths, but the lessons remain urgently relevant. If this examination of how historical narratives are constructed and weaponized resonated with you, subscribe for more content that separates documentary evidence from sensationalist fiction. And leave a comment. What other historical common knowledge deserves rigorous re-examination? The past is never as simple as the stories we tell about it, and the stories we choose to tell reveal as much about us as about history itself.